The sun was shining brightly over the Florida coast as the Johnson family pulled up to their beachside hotel. John, a tall man with a kind smile and a slight touch of gray in his hair, parked the car and glanced over at his wife, Sarah. She smiled back, brushing a strand of blonde hair away from her face, already excited for the peaceful days ahead. In the back seat, their 3 children were buzzing with excitement. Emily, the oldest at 12, was eagerly scrolling through her phone, looking for the best spots on the beach to explore. Her younger brother, Jack, only 8 years old, was bouncing up and down in his seat, asking when they could start building sandcastles. Little Grace, just 2 years old, giggled softly, her big blue eyes wide with wonder as she held her favorite stuffed bunny. "This is going to be the best vacation ever," Emily exclaimed, hopping out of the car as soon as they arrived. She stretched her arms out wide, breathing in the salty sea air. John and Sarah unloaded the bags, and soon the whole family was settled into their cozy hotel room, complete with a view of the endless ocean. The waves gently lapped at the shore, and the warm breeze rustled through the palm trees. It was the perfect scene of tranquility. "How about we head to the beach right now?" John suggested, slipping on his sunglasses. "The water looks great." "Yes," Jack shouted, grabbing his sand toys and racing towards the door. Sarah laughed as she picked up Grace and followed, with Emily close behind, phone still in hand. Once they reached the beach, the family spread out their towels on the soft sand. Jack immediately began digging a moat for his sandcastle, while Emily splashed in the shallow water, her laughter ringing through the air. Sarah sat under the shade of a colorful beach umbrella, cradling Grace as she gently rocked her back and forth. John waded out into the water, feeling the cool waves lap against his legs. "Come on, kids," he called out. "The water's perfect." Emily and Jack ran to join him, their shrieks of joy mixing with the sound of the waves. It was a perfect day. The sun was warm, the ocean calm, and their hearts full. Everything felt right. But far on the horizon, beyond what their eyes could see, the ocean was beginning to stir. The calm water hid the silent force that was gathering strength deep below the surface. No one on the beach could have known, but soon everything would change. For now, though, the Johnsons were happy, their laughter echoing under the vast cloudless sky. The family enjoyed their carefree moments, completely unaware of the danger creeping toward them, like a shadow on the far edge of the sea. The morning sun bathed the beach in a golden glow. It was another perfect day for the Johnson family, and the ocean beckoned with its calm, inviting waves. John and Sarah were preparing for another day of fun in the water with their children. Jack was already wearing his snorkel mask, bouncing on his toes in excitement. Emily, more relaxed but equally eager, had her beach ball tucked under one arm. Little Grace clung to Sarah's leg, babbling happily as her parents prepared her tiny swimsuit. "Ready for some swimming?" John asked, smiling at Sarah as he slipped his arm around her shoulders. They both looked out at the vast, peaceful ocean, stretching endlessly in front of them. "Absolutely," Sarah replied, glancing down at Grace, who squealed with joy as a soft breeze ruffled her sandy blonde hair. As they made their way towards the water, something strange caught Sarah's attention. "John," she said, her voice hesitant, "look at the water." John frowned and followed her gaze. The ocean, which had just moments ago been gently rolling against the shore, was now receding rapidly. The tide was pulling back far faster than it should have, exposing rocks and shells that had been hidden beneath the surface. The distant ocean floor, usually unseen, was now eerily visible. "What's happening, Dad?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with concern as she stopped in her tracks. John's heart began to race. His instincts told him something was very wrong. He looked around, noticing that the other beachgoers had paused too, watching the ocean retreat with growing unease. Then, without warning, a deep, thunderous sound rumbled through the air, like the roar of a distant train coming closer. "Run!" John shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand as panic set in. He turned to the kids. "Emily! Jack! Get back to the hotel! Now!" But it was too late. In the distance, a dark, towering wall of water appeared on the horizon. It was moving fast, faster than anything John had ever seen. The tsunami, silent at first, was now roaring as it sped toward the shore, swallowing everything in its path. "John!" Sarah screamed, holding Grace tightly as the realization of the disaster hit them. John wrapped his arms around her and their children, trying to shield them as the massive wave rushed forward with terrifying force. Everything happened in a blur. The sound of the wave crashing was deafening, like the roar of 1,000 storms combined. The wall of water slammed into them with such power that it tore John's grip from Sarah's hand. They were all swept up, spinning in the churning, violent waters. John struggled to surface, gasping for air as the water tossed him like a rag doll. He could barely make out anything. Debris floated everywhere, and the once clear sky was now shrouded in mist and chaos. "Sarah!" he shouted, choking on seawater. "Emily! Jack!" There was no response. He looked around frantically, but the powerful waves had separated them. Sarah and Grace were nowhere to be seen. Emily and Jack had disappeared, swallowed by the relentless surge of water. The world had become a swirling nightmare of debris, broken beach chairs, and desperate screams. John fought to stay afloat, his mind racing with panic and fear for his family. He had to find them. He had to get to them. But the water was relentless, pushing him farther and farther from where they had been. The once peaceful beach, so full of laughter and joy just moments ago, was now a scene of devastation. The force of nature had ripped the Johnson family apart, leaving John alone, helpless against the overpowering waves. The world was a chaotic blur of water, debris, and deafening noise. Sarah clung desperately to Emily's hand as the powerful wave carried them through the flooded ruins of the beachfront. The force of the water was terrifying, crashing against them with no mercy. Broken pieces of wood, beach umbrellas, and shattered glass swirled around, threatening to pull them under at any moment. "Hold on, Emily!" Sarah screamed, her voice barely audible above the roaring water. She tightened her grip on her daughter's hand, her other arm wrapped around a large piece of debris, a shattered plank from a beach shack. It was the only thing keeping them from being sucked into the deep, dark waters below. "I'm trying, Mom!" Emily shouted back, her face pale with fear. The 12-year-old was fighting to stay afloat, her legs kicking frantically to keep her head above the waves. Her eyes darted around, wide with terror, searching for any sign of her father, brother, or baby sister. But all she could see was the churning, relentless water. The wave pushed them farther inland, crashing them into what was once a row of palm trees, now broken and bent by the force of the tsunami. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with panic. "Where are John and the others?" she thought desperately, but there was no time for questions. Survival was the only thing that mattered now. "Mom, I'm scared," Emily whimpered, her voice trembling as she clung to her mother. Tears mixed with the salt water on her cheeks. "I know, sweetheart. I'm scared too," Sarah admitted, her voice shaky but strong. "But we have to keep fighting. We have to stay together." With every ounce of strength, Sarah kicked against the waves, pulling Emily closer to a large piece of floating debris, an overturned boat that had been washed inland. "Grab on!" she shouted, pushing Emily towards the boat. Emily reached out, her hands shaking, and finally managed to get a grip on the edge of the hull. Together, mother and daughter clung to the boat, trying to catch their breath as the water raged around them. For a moment, it felt like the worst had passed, but Sarah knew better. The danger was far from over. Meanwhile, miles away, John was struggling against the same unforgiving tide. He had lost sight of Jack and Grace in the chaos, his heart breaking as the wave tore them from his reach. The force of the water had flung him into a tangle of broken furniture and debris, and now, gasping for air, he fought to stay afloat. "Jack! Grace!" he screamed, his voice hoarse. But there was no answer. His mind was clouded with fear, imagining the worst. Were they safe? Had the wave carried them somewhere far? Or worse, were they gone? He couldn't think about that now. The water was relentless, and his body was already exhausted from fighting it. He grabbed onto a floating door, using it as a makeshift raft to keep his head above the waves. His muscles ached, and every breath burned in his chest. But he couldn't give up. Not until he found his children. As he drifted on the floodwaters, John's eyes scanned the horizon, desperate for any sign of life. He saw people in the distance, clinging to trees and wreckage, their faces full of fear. The beach, once a place of joy and laughter, was now a graveyard of destruction. And somewhere in this nightmare, Jack and Grace were out there, alone. "Please, God," John whispered, his voice cracking, "keep them safe." Suddenly, in the distance, he spotted something, a small figure clinging to a piece of debris. His heart leaped in his chest. "Jack!" he shouted, using what little strength he had left to paddle toward the figure. As he got closer, relief washed over him. It was Jack, pale but alive, holding onto a piece of wood for dear life. Tears filled John's eyes as he reached his son, grabbing hold of the wood to pull him closer. "Jack, I'm here!" "Dad!" Jack sobbed, his small body trembling with fear. "Where's Grace? Where's Mom?" "I don't know, buddy," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we're going to find them. I promise." Back on the other side of the ruined beach, Sarah and Emily had managed to make it to higher ground, pulling themselves onto a large pile of debris that had collected near a crumbled building. They were soaked, shivering, and terrified, but they were alive. "We have to find the others," Sarah said, her voice resolute. She wasn't sure how, but she knew she couldn't stop now. Her family was out there somewhere, and they needed her just as much as she needed them. As the floodwaters began to recede, Sarah helped Emily to her feet, their legs unsteady but determined. "We'll find them, Mom," Emily said softly, trying to be brave. "Yes," Sarah agreed, her eyes scanning the devastation around them. "We will." Together they set off into the wreckage, their hearts heavy but their hope still alive. Somewhere in the ruins of this shattered paradise, their family was waiting. They just had to survive long enough to find each other again. Days passed in a haze of exhaustion and uncertainty. The beach, once full of life, was now unrecognizable, reduced to rubble and broken dreams. Sarah and Emily, battered but alive, had found temporary shelter with a group of survivors. The rescue teams, arriving from nearby cities, had set up tents and makeshift hospitals, treating the injured and giving food and water to those who had lost everything. Sarah sat under a flimsy canvas tent, her arms wrapped tightly around Emily. The young girl had been quiet since the disaster, her usual spark dimmed by the overwhelming trauma of what had happened. Sarah could hardly blame her. She herself felt numb, like she was living in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. Every face in the crowd looked lost. Every conversation was about missing loved ones. "Mom, do you think we'll find them?" Emily asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She hadn't cried since the wave hit, but her eyes were always filled with the questions she was too afraid to ask. Sarah paused, looking into her daughter's worried eyes. "I don't know, sweetheart," she admitted softly, her own heart aching. "But we can't give up. Your dad is out there. Jack and Grace are out there. We have to believe that they're safe." Emily nodded, resting her head on Sarah's shoulder. She wanted to believe her mom, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. The shelter was full of people who were still searching, hoping for a miracle. And every day that passed without news made that hope a little harder to hold on to. Meanwhile, miles away, John and Jack were facing their own struggles. The tsunami had thrown them into a different part of the destroyed town. And for days they had wandered through the wreckage, searching for food, water, and most importantly, their family. Jack held tightly to John's hand as they walked through the ruined streets, now quiet except for the distant sounds of rescue helicopters overhead. Every step felt heavier as the days dragged on. They had been lucky enough to find small bits of food, a few scattered cans of soup, a bottle of water, but the days were growing longer and their strength was fading. "Dad, are we ever going to find them?" Jack asked, his voice trembling. He had been brave, far braver than any 8-year-old should ever have to be, but the worry was starting to creep in. He missed his mom. He missed Emily. And most of all, he missed Grace, who had been ripped from their arms in the chaos. John knelt down, placing his hands firmly on Jack's shoulders. "Listen, buddy," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes filled with the same fear Jack was feeling. "We're going to find them. I don't know when, and I don't know how, but I promise you, we will." Jack nodded, but the exhaustion was clear on his face. He was tired, not just physically, but emotionally. The constant search, the unrelenting hunger, and the weight of not knowing what had happened to the rest of their family was wearing him down. Suddenly, as they rounded a corner, John spotted movement in the distance. A group of people, survivors like them, walking towards what looked like a gathering point. His heart leaped with cautious hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the break they needed. "Jack, look," John said, pointing ahead. "Let's go check it out." As they approached the group, John's heart began to race. There was a rescue camp set up not far from where they stood, with tents and aid workers handing out food and water. People were talking, sharing their stories, hoping to be reunited with their families. It was a small glimmer of hope in a world that had been turned upside down. John and Jack made their way to the camp, their steps quickening with newfound energy. As they approached one of the aid workers, John spoke up, his voice thick with desperation. "Please, we've been separated from my wife and daughters. Have you heard anything?" The worker, a kind-looking woman in her 40s, nodded. "We've had several families reunited here. There's a shelter a few miles away where we've been taking survivors. If they're out there, they might be there." John's heart surged. Could Sarah and the girls be waiting for them at that shelter? It was the first real glimmer of hope he had felt in days, and it was enough to push him forward. "Thank you," John said, grabbing Jack's hand. "Come on, Jack, let's go find them." At the shelter, Sarah and Emily were watching the crowds with growing anxiety. Each time a new group arrived, they scanned the faces, hoping to see the familiar sight of John and Jack, and maybe, just maybe, Grace safe in John's arms. But so far, there had been no sign of them. Every time the rescue workers brought in more survivors, their hearts soared, only to sink again when the faces they searched for were nowhere to be found. Then, as the afternoon sun began to fade, Emily saw something. In the distance, two figures were approaching the shelter, hand in hand. One tall, the other small. Her heart skipped a beat. "Mom," Emily whispered, standing up, her eyes wide. "It's them! It's Dad and Jack!" Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she followed Emily's gaze. There, walking toward them, covered in dirt and exhaustion, but very much alive, were John and Jack. Tears filled her eyes as she stood up, her legs shaking beneath her. "John!" she cried, running toward them, Emily right beside her. John's eyes filled with relief as he saw them coming. He scooped Jack up in his arms and ran to meet them, wrapping them both in a tight embrace. For a moment, the world around them disappeared, and all that mattered was that they were together again. But as they held each other, the unspoken question lingered in the air. Where was Grace? The smallest member of their family was still out there somewhere, and their reunion wouldn't be complete until they found her. The glimmer of hope was real, but the search was far from over. The sun was setting over the makeshift hospital camp, casting long shadows across the rows of tents and emergency vehicles. The air was filled with the sounds of distant helicopters, the hum of generators, and the murmurs of survivors telling their stories of loss and survival. It was a scene of devastation, but also one of hope, as families reunited in the aftermath of the disaster. Inside one of the medical tents, Sarah sat beside Emily, holding her hand as a nurse gently bandaged a cut on her daughter's leg. Jack was asleep in John's lap, exhausted from the day's events but finally at peace, his head resting on his father's chest. They had found each other, and for a moment that was all that mattered. But the joy of their reunion was incomplete. Grace, the youngest and most vulnerable member of their family, was still missing. "Do you think she's out there?" Emily asked softly, her eyes filled with worry. "Do you think we'll find her?" Sarah bit her lip, her heart aching with fear, but she nodded. "We have to believe she's safe, Emily," she said. "The rescue teams are doing everything they can. We'll find her." John gently stroked Jack's hair, his eyes heavy with exhaustion and pain. "I just hope we're not too late," he whispered, his voice filled with a fear he couldn't shake. Suddenly, a commotion erupted outside the tent. The sound of hurried footsteps and raised voices broke the quiet of the camp. John looked up, his heart pounding in his chest, as he heard one word repeated again and again. "Baby." He stood quickly, setting Jack down on the cot beside Sarah. "Stay here," he said, his voice tight with tension. "I'll go see what's happening." Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with hope. "Please, John. Please find out if it's her." John stepped outside the tent, his eyes scanning the crowded camp. A group of rescue workers had gathered near the entrance, and in the center of them, he saw a familiar figure. His heart leapt in his chest. One of the medics was carrying a small bundle wrapped in a blanket, and the tiny hand that peeked out from the fabric was unmistakable. "Grace," John breathed, his legs suddenly weak with relief. He pushed through the crowd, his voice breaking. "Grace!" The medic looked up as John approached, a smile on her face. "Are you the father?" she asked, her voice kind and gentle. John nodded, tears filling his eyes as he reached out for his daughter. "Yes, I'm her father," he said, his voice trembling. Is she okay?" "She's dehydrated and shaken up," But she's going to be just fine, the medic said, carefully placing the tiny bundle into John's arms. Grace stirred, her small face peeking out from the blanket, her eyes fluttering open as she recognized her father's familiar warmth. "Dada," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with trust. John held her close, unable to stop the tears that streamed down his face. "Oh, baby girl," he whispered, kissing her forehead. "We've been looking everywhere for you." As he turned back toward the tent, his heart swelled with gratitude and relief. He could hardly believe it. After days of fear and uncertainty, they were finally whole again. Inside the tent, Sarah saw John approaching with Grace in his arms, and her breath caught in her throat. She stood, her legs trembling, as she rushed to meet him at the entrance. "Grace!" she cried, tears streaming down her face as she reached out to take her daughter. "Oh my God, you're okay!" Grace, still wrapped in the blanket, smiled faintly as she nestled into her mother's arms. Emily ran to her side, wrapping her arms around both her mom and her sister, while Jack, woken by the noise, rubbed his eyes and stumbled over to join the embrace. For a long moment, the Johnson family stood together, their arms wrapped around each other, their hearts full of emotion. They had been through hell, separated by the cruel force of nature, but they had survived, and now at last they were reunited. That night, as the stars twinkled faintly in the darkened sky, the family sat together under the dim glow of the hospital tent. Grace was fast asleep in Sarah's arms, her tiny fingers curled around her mother's hand. Jack lay beside John, his head resting on his father's shoulder, while Emily sat close by, watching the peaceful scene unfold. "We've been given a second chance," John said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. "I didn't know if we'd make it through this. But now that we're all here, I can't imagine anything more important than this. Us. Together." Sarah nodded, tears still in her eyes. "We've been through so much," she whispered, "but we're alive. And that's all that matters." Emily looked up at her parents, her heart swelling with emotion. "I didn't understand how fragile life could be until now," she said quietly. "But I'm so thankful we're all okay." John smiled, gently placing his hand on her shoulder. "We've all learned something from this," he said. "Life is precious. We can't take any of it for granted." As the family sat together in the quiet of the night, they felt a deep sense of peace settle over them. The disaster had left scars, both physical and emotional, but it had also taught them the value of love, family, and resilience. They had survived the unimaginable, and together they would face whatever the future held. With hope in their hearts and gratitude for each other, the Johnson family looked ahead, knowing that as long as they had one another, they could endure anything.